Hello, and welcome to the newest episode in Dialogue Topics. I'm Taylor Petrie, editor of Dialogue, a Journal of Mormon Thought. This season, we're talking about the history of LDS scholarship on specific themes, exploring in depth a topic to consider how dialogue has been a forum for these important issues since its founding. We'll also bring you up to date on these topics with our more recent issues to discuss some of the current trends. All of our topic pages are curated to bring you comprehensive collections of annotated scholarship and may be found at dialoguejournal.com/topic pages, all one word, or navigate there from our homepage. You'll find amazing resources and research on tons of issues. And thanks for your sustaining support. This month, we're looking at the history of scholarship on LGBTQ issues. If you're catching this in June when it's released, happy Pride Month. I have to say that this is an incredibly interesting topic. As some of our listeners know, I've written about LGBTQ history in my book Tabernacles of Clay, Sexuality and Gender in Modern Mormonism, which I'm happy to announce was just awarded the Best Book Award from the Mormon History Association. Anyway, it's fair to say that I know a bit about this history, and I will try to use that to contextualize some of what's going on. But I also want to say that I learned a lot in researching this episode. Hopefully I can communicate some of that, the exciting history of scholarship and the pathos of so much of what is behind this scholarship. There's another thing that I want to point out. This wasn't a topic that was central to the founding of dialogue, like so many of the other social issues around race and gender, or even some of the long-standing historical issues. But it's become central to its identity in the last 30 years. Dialogue is proud to be the premier place for scholarship on this topic, the place where such scholarship has flourished, representing a wide variety of perspectives in true dialogue. A quick note on my use of LGBTQ in this episode, a current but imperfect acronym to describe non-normative sexualities and genders. There are sometimes other versions of this label, and leaving out a particular letter is not an intentional slight, just an indication of where the bulk of conversations have been. I do make some mentions of scholarship on intersex issues in this episode too. The history of this particular alliance between the various populations is its own story, and I recognize that it is somewhat anachronistic to project this alliance back into the past when it didn't necessarily exist, but it remains a useful shorthand for the purposes of this brief story that I tell here. Let's get into it. Act 1. A new topic. LDS leaders began talking about homosexuality in the 1950s for the first time, moving away from the previous understanding of sodomy. The difference is more than just terminological. It represents a real paradigm shift. While sodomy was considered to be a set of acts that one might engage in, homosexuality referred to a broader set of practices, including desires, but also other gendered behaviors. LDS leaders were borrowing these ideas from popular mainstream psychological theories. The U.S. in general was engaged in a broad anti-homosexuality scare during the 1950s and 60s. But a few things happened in the late 60s and early 70s that changed. First, the gay rights movement, as it was then called, gained greater prominence and began to speak back, to make their voices heard over the medical community which had stigmatized them as pathological and abnormal. They were saying, "Leave us alone, protect us from police brutality, and let us live our lives as normal citizens." The second thing that happened was the scientific abandonment of earlier theories of homosexual pathology, which was replaced by saying that such desires were rarer, but not abnormal psychologically. Conservative institutions, however, were wary of both of these developments, including the LDS Church, which fought against legalization of homosexuality and fought to preserve psychological anti-homosexual theories. there was a wave of new manuals, programs, pamphlets, and talks during the 1970s for the first time really addressing this issue in the church. This is the context for the rise of a new discourse on this topic in LDS circles. SOLUS, SOLUS, Latin for alone, by an anonymous gay man in the fall 1976 issue of Dialogue is the first entry on this topic. As far as I can tell, this is the first instance of an LGBTQ voice in any LDS publication. It marks the beginning of the modern LDS LGBTQ movement, and it is a doozy. This 5-page essay is part of an issue that's dedicated to questions of LDS sexuality. It's one of the classic important issues in the formative years of Dialogue. I won't regale you about all of the foundational articles in this particular issue, but suffice it to say that I think that this whole issue marks a key moment in what I call the Mormon sexual revolution, the LDS response to the reformulation of sexual values in the 1960s. Anyway, SOLUS. President Kimball is leading the church and for 2+ decades had made conservative sexual morality, including opposition to homosexuality, one of his defining issues. But this essay opens up from a few years earlier at the 1973 priesthood session of General Conference under President Harold B. Lee, in which he spoke on marriage. The author then recounts why he never married and never will. He walks through several traumatic moments of childhood, from a childhood rape to bullying due to failures to perform masculinity. There was intense pressure to marry. One Sunday, he recalls, I heard Elder Joseph Fielding Smith say that homosexuality was so filthy and important that he would rather see his sons dead than homosexual. In growing confusion, I tried to analyze my problem. Was I forever lost? This kind of extremely harsh rhetoric was commonplace from the 50s to the early 80s, and one can see how it brutalized so many. Prayer, blessings, soul searching. He met with a general authority seeking counsel who told him that he should seek masculine activities in life, like playing basketball, and referred him to a therapist who practiced some of the cure efforts that the church was promoting at the time. Time passes into his mid-30s, and he eventually just stops trying to date women, remaining very active in his ward throughout, and finally comes to peace with the fact that he will never marry. But then President Lee spoke, and the pressure campaign from friends and family ramped up again. More work with counselors. Quote, in a lifetime of church activity, I have yet to hear a single word of compassion or understanding for homosexuals spoken from the pulpit. We are more than a family-oriented church. Our auxiliaries and priesthood quorums presuppose marriage. A single, much less homosexual, does not fit in. Still, I have a strong testimony of the gospel. I know the church is true, and I want to remain loyal and active. I can only hope that he who welcomed to his side sinners, publicans, and harlots will grant the same grace to me, and that his church will also. It's a somber text from someone dedicated to the church, but estranged from church culture. And in retrospect, a damning report. The man was over 40 and never heard a single word of compassion. There are several letters to the editor, responding, some expressing compassion. Others were from gay men who resonated with the message. The letters to the editor in Dialogue became the first place where gay LDS members could communicate about this topic in print. SOLUS and the early letters responding to it come just a few years before another foundational text in the early LDS gay rights movement, though it wasn't published in Dialogue. An undergraduate at BYU, Cloyd Jenkins, self-published a 50-plus page pamphlet that was a manifesto on why the church should accept homosexuality. Called Prologue, and also the Pain Papers, it's a critique of the psychological theories that the church was relying on to condemn homosexuality, and a deep dive into the scriptural and historical arguments in favor of accepting homosexuality. It was just the first of its kind, but it was one that was quite different from the pained SOLUS. It was more strident and polemical about church doctrine, not just culture. And it marked an early split in the LDS LGBTQ response, reformers versus revolutionaries. Around the same time, Affirmation was founded, an LDS advocacy organization that grew quickly with chapters around the West. The revolutionaries were on the move. Another early kind of literature and dialogue in this period is from LDS psychologists. Val D. Hemming wrote a 2-page article in the winter 1977 issue, just a little more than a year after SOLUS, probably responding to it. Titled, "Warning, Labels Can Be Hazardous to Your Health," he cautioned against people labeling themselves or others homosexuals. He argued that it could become a self-fulfilling prophecy, and that it was an impediment to a cure. This would become a major theory of Elder Boyd K. Packer and others who instituted a cultural taboo on the term that lasted until the early 2000s, when self-labeling became somewhat more tolerated. This doctrine has roots in the reparative therapy theories. In the fall 1979 issue, LDS evolutionary biologists wrote a really important piece, ahead of its time in some ways, challenging the idea of binary gender. In his article, Intersexes in Humans, an Introductory Exploration, he laid out clearly the problem. We can't say that sex is binary by divine design when it's not binary in nature. So this early period actually shows an interesting diversity of approaches. LDS LGBTQ voices shared their stories, often anonymously still, and pleaded for more compassionate approaches. There are also LDS psychologists buttressing church teachings that homosexuality can and should be changed. And there are biologists that are starting to weigh in. These scientific fights, coupled with the empathetic persuasion of personal experience, set the stage for much of what is coming.
Mom had the loudest voice and strongest opinions in the household.
It's impossible to feel the spirit in these episodes.
From there, it was the grim weeper. How could you have done this to me, to us?
That may sound blasphemous, but it's true.
She was determined and committed to her sometimes eccentric opinions.
Meanwhile, I'm wondering who's this wonderful fairy tale us he's talking about.
Most of my mixed state experiences are channeled into a prayer to my Heavenly Father to please send help. Please take me out of this. Please show me a sign that you still love me.
No, of course not. That's why I'm here. I'm willing to do whatever to make things right.
This is Dialogue Out Loud, a curated selection of fiction and essays from the pages of Dialogue, a Journal of Mormon Thought, brought to life through voice and music.
I feel entirely alone in a permanent night, blocked from sunlight by the wall of earth that is my chemical imbalance.
My parents were persuaded that this was not just an adolescent whim and allowed me to be baptized 3 days shy of my 19th birthday.
Oh, he'll hold my hand in sacrament meeting and take me by the arm and open the car door and do all that chivalrous Sir Walter Raleigh stuff in public. But safe at home, I'm invisible.
This year, we're bringing you even more great audio stories from our quarterly journal, including pieces by Neil David Sylvester, Linda Hoffman Kimball, Monica Crowfoot, and more. Subscribe to the Dialogue podcast to keep up on our latest episodes, or go to dialoguejournal.com for this and more great audio content. That's dialoguejournal.com.
Dialogue Podcast Network.